Thank you all for coming. There you go, recording in progress. Thank you all for coming to this webinar run by the Alliance for Nature New South Wales about New South Wales land clearing and nature protection laws. You might have heard that last week, the New South Wales government's biodiversity report found that New South Wales could lose 500 species in the next 100 years. And a key reason for this is that our laws make habitat destruction easy and legal. The New South Wales government made an election commitment to help fix this problem, but a year later, they're yet to deliver. And so tonight you'll hear about why right now is the moment to ensure the New South Wales Premier and key ministers hear directly from the many thousands of us who expect this critical election promise to be delivered. Next slide, thanks, Ange. And so before we get into the agenda proper, I would of course like to start by acknowledging that I am joining this webinar from stolen lands, and I assume most of you or all of you are as well. I'm dialing in from Awabakal and Warramai lands in Wollabimba, Newcastle, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands. Given the topic of tonight's webinar, it feels important to acknowledge that First Nations people have practiced a system of care and custodianship of lands and sea across this continent for many, many millennia. And it was colonisation that introduced the premise of private ownership of country, of fencing, of enclosing and extracting from nature. And it is this system that has landed us in the trouble that we're in now. While we talk about law reform on so-called freehold land and the role it will have in either improving or condemning New South Wales biodiversity, we acknowledge that we also need to challenge the paradigm of extraction for profit and mature our attitude toward protecting nature to one which sees conservation and culture as inseparable. More must be done to progress land back, and resourcing for care of country must be reasonable and equitable. Sovereignty was never ceded. Next slide, thank you, Ange. So before I introduce our speakers, I'll let you know that Alliance for Nature New South Wales is a coalition of leading environmental organisations working together to achieve the best possible outcomes for habitat and wildlife. Together, we represent 220 member groups or branches and around 250,000 supporters and landholders across the state. And now I'd like to let you know that tonight we will hear from Jax, the Executive Officer from the Nature Conservation Council New South Wales. She'll be telling us about the timeline of how we got to this moment. Seren from the Environmental Defenders Office will talk about the essential changes needed to create a better future for habitat in New South Wales on regulated rural land. And Clancy, the comms manager for the Nature Conservation Council New South Wales, will talk you through the politics and why the actions we're asking you to take today can make a difference. So we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, not a whole lot because we're in a pretty tight schedule. So pop any questions you have in the chat along the way and we'll try to come back to as many as possible at the end. And just a quick reminder before I hand over to Jax that on Zoom, make sure you keep yourself muted so everybody can hear the speakers without interruption. That's all from me. I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Jax.
Thank you so much, Vic, and thanks for that beautiful introduction. So for those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Jax. I'm the Executive Officer at the Nature Conservation Council. And yes, I'm going to take you through the story so far with a bit of a timeline. So it's the 25th of August 2017 and a new legal framework for regulating land clearing and development has commenced in New South Wales. This new framework, championed by the Nationals, put a strong emphasis on deregulation, particularly for land clearing in rural zoned land. So previous laws that had prevented broad-scale land clearing, unless it was shown to either maintain or improve environmental outcomes, was shelved in favour of self-assessable codes, which meant that landholders were assessing the value of the ecology on their land and then deciding what to do about it. There was also a new and big range of allowable activities introduced, which meant that while a regulatory burden for farmers was lifted, land use change was happening with basically no oversight at all. The pendulum has swung completely to the side of the landholder. Alongside looser habitat destruction rules, a more flexible biodiversity offset scheme was introduced. At the time, environment groups were really concerned that these changes would weaken protections or did weaken protections for biodiversity and that land clearing rates would increase. Next slide, please. Thank you. And sure enough, since each year we've watched land clearing rates grow and stay well above the rates prior to 2016. Most concerningly though, unallocated clearing rates, which means that there's no evidence actually to show if the clearing is legal or illegal, that's at the moment, about half of all clearing. It escalated to about 3/4 of all clearing at one point. So we just don't know what's going on out there. Next, please, Anne. Thank you. So by 2020, that's 4 years ago now, our worst fears were realised. Regulatory failure was confirmed by the Natural Resources Commission, the New South Wales Audit Office, and a parliamentary inquiry. The government's own published land clearing data showed a tripling in land clearing rates to an average of about 95,000 hectares each year. That's not even to mention the biodiversity offsetting scheme, which was also part of this reform package. And that scheme has been found by investigative journalists, an independent audit, and a parliamentary inquiry too to be ineffective and corrupt. We should note that in 2016, the Biodiversity Conservation Act did include some important conservation and restoration projects. Some of those include like the Saving Us Species program, and these have seen some outcomes. But if land is being conserved on one block and cleared right next door, we just can't keep nature safe. It was actually just never going to work. So when the laws changed in 2017, the then government promised to evaluate the impact of the changes it made 3 years later. That never happened. And instead, we've just been watching the clearing rates stay high and all the biodiversity indicators get worse across the state. Sure enough, as Vic mentioned last week, particularly, the consequences of this, of this and other current legal settings are being borne out in the government's own research with the 2022 State of the Environment report and this Biodiversity Indicator Program report, which is what's on the slide in front of you, showing that habitat loss through habitat clearing is a primary driver of the biodiversity crisis that we're in. And without drastic action to stop deforestation and habitat loss and build the resilience of ecosystems to climate change, many more species will become endangered and then disappear for good. Last year, time's going fast, Ken Henry led a 5-year statutory review into the Biodiversity Conservation Act and the regulation of rural land, which we were mentioning just before. The two reviews came up with quite different interpretations of what the risks are to biodiversity. On the next slide, we've got the summary of what Ken Henry said in his report, that while the Biodiversity Conservation Act has been in operation for only 5 years, we just can't pretend that it's ever going to achieve its objectives, is essentially what he said. He also acknowledged that, like in other places around the world, we have to move to a mindset of nature positive if we're going to have any confidence that future generations will have the opportunity to be as well off as we are. So, comes to today. The government is currently working out how to respond to Ken Henry's scathing review and how to meet their election commitments, which were fix the biodiversity offsetting scheme and stop runaway land clearing. So 7 years after the way we protect habitat in New South Wales changed dramatically, we finally have a really concrete opportunity to influence the government response. So late last year, we made a video to summarise everything I've just told you. So we're going to play that now. Hopefully the sound works okay. And we'll show you where to access this yourselves following the webinar. So let's hit play.
Welcome to beautiful New South Wales, where we cut down 50 million trees a year. Yep, 50 million. Habitat clearing is now the greatest threat to biodiversity in New South Wales, and it's getting worse. In 2016, the former government introduced a loophole that allowed people who stand to benefit the most to self-assess the ecological value of their land and approve its destruction. Then there's environmental offsetting, an accounting trick that allows developers to destroy critical ecosystems by claiming they've protected another area. Stopping habitat destruction in New South Wales would protect more ecosystems than all our national parks combined and prevent more emissions than Sydney uses in a year. Click the link below to help us stand up for nature.
Thank you. I'll get that off before it launches into some other random thing. With that, I'm going to hand over to Seren from the EDO to talk about what needs to change.
Great. Thanks, Jax. Good evening, everyone. So I am going to talk a little bit about opportunities for law reform that will address habitat loss. So in our view, one of the key gaps in government strategy to address habitat loss is strong laws. So as Jax mentioned, on one hand, we've got governments investing in species conservation and management, such as the Save Our Species program, acquiring land for national parks, supporting private landholders to enter into conservation agreements. But on the other hand, we have laws that are failing to effectively stop habitat loss from activities such as land clearing and urban development. So without legislative reform to address habitat clearing, our efforts to conserve habitat are being undermined by those lax laws that continue to allow habitat destruction to occur. I'm going to talk about three main areas for reform tonight: land clearing laws, the offsets framework, and then some opportunities to strengthen safeguards and close loopholes generally. Next slide, please, Anne. Thank you. So in terms of land clearing laws, Jax mentioned and provided an overview already. The laws were introduced in 2017. EDO and environment groups at the time were concerned that the new laws would contribute to increasing land clearing rates, and sure enough, as Jack mentioned, they did. We essentially moved from a system that had a clear objective to prevent broad-scale clearing unless it improves or maintains environmental outcomes, to a system that facilitated land clearing, particularly through self-assessable codes. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of key changes that could be made to the law to make a start at fixing the land clearing laws. The first would be to reinstate that clear objective to prevent broad-scale clearing. And I'll repeat what was in the previous law. The objective was to prevent broad-scale clearing unless it improves or maintains environmental outcomes. So there were two key components to that objective. First, there was a clear legislative commitment to prevent clearing. And second, there was a clear standard that any clearing must maintain or improve environmental outcomes. So neither of those elements exist in the current laws. So we really need to reinstate that clear legislative commitment to prevent broad-scale clearing, and we need to make sure that we've got a clear threshold that will ensure that any clearing that is approved will not lead to worse outcomes for the environment. By setting that legislative intent up front, that'll allow for changes to be made to the laws that will help us meet that clear objective. In terms of the current framework, we've been quite critical about certain elements of the framework that we would want to see improved. So the first is the native vegetation regulatory map, which 7 years since the laws began is still not finalised. Now, the map is critical because what it does is it underpins the entire regime. It identifies the different categories of land across the state and says what rules apply to each category of land. So without that map in place, we're left with landholders and decision makers trying to figure out, by referring to definitions in the legislation, what rules apply to them and where they need to be applied. This means that there's ongoing uncertainty about exactly where and what rules apply to land clearing. So we really need to get that map in place if we're going to be able to apply the rules properly. The next thing we need to do is make sure that we've got appropriate assessment pathways with suitable assessment and oversight. So what I mean by that is we need to make sure that land clearing is properly assessed and approved. Jack's mentioned that there's been an increased reliance on these self-assessable codes that basically require landholders to apply the technical rules themselves and assess whether they can carry out clearing or not. And there's no opportunity to assess impacts on a case-by-case basis. What we would want to see is code-based clearing strictly limited and only available to generally low impact clearing. And substantial clearing should actually go through a proper assessment and approval process, just like any other land use. And just finally on land clearing, there's been some criticism, especially from the New South Wales Audit Office, about the enforcement of current laws. The Audit Office found in 2019 that the laws weren't actually being effectively regulated and managed. So what we need to see is strong laws that are properly enforced. We need to see ongoing implementation of those recommendations from the Audit Office and ongoing funding for outreach to landholders to ensure they understand and apply the laws properly. We need to continue the monitoring so we can know where land clearing is happening and whether it is lawful or not. And we need strong compliance and enforcement to ensure that land clearing laws are being properly applied. This is particularly important in the current case where there's self-assessment and a risk that landholders and decision makers are not applying the laws correctly. We've got a detailed report that provides our recommendations for law reform. I'm pretty sure Jax has included the link to that report in the slides, so you'll be able to have a look at our detailed recommendations in that report. In terms of the offset scheme, many of you might be familiar with the way offsets work and the criticisms there have been around offsets. So in 2017, the New South Wales government introduced a new biodiversity offset scheme for New South Wales. And in our view, the new scheme was a significant weakening of the rules around offset. What it did was it moved away from those strict like-for-like offset requirements and introduced new rules to vary offset requirements and also the option to pay money into a fund rather than securing those upfront offsets directly. So there's been a lot of criticism about the scheme and concerns that it is essentially just a tool to facilitate development and that clearing that might otherwise have been refused due to environmental outcomes is now going ahead because their proponents are allowed to rely on this offset scheme. And there's concerns that the scheme's not actually delivering the environmental outcomes intended. Those concerns were confirmed by a parliamentary inquiry in 2022, which found multiple problems with the scheme and said there were fundamental questions about whether it can achieve its stated goals. It made a series of recommendations, including that the scheme be overhauled. And as Jax mentioned, the Labor government has committed to fix the scheme. We have not yet seen, though, what they're planning to do in terms of fixing up the scheme. So again, we've written quite extensively on what a best practice offsetting scheme should look like. And a few things I just wanted to highlight to you. We need to enforce the mitigation hierarchy properly. So the mitigation hierarchy essentially says you must avoid and mitigate impacts before turning to offsets. However, there are concerns that that mitigation hierarchy is actually not being applied in practice. So we need the hierarchy to be clearly set out in the legislation as a mandatory precondition before any offsetting option is considered, and we need it to be properly implemented and enforced. We would also like to see clear limits on the use of offsets. For example, red flags or no-go areas where you cannot offset. This is particularly relevant when you've got things like critical habitat or threatened species or communities that cannot withstand further loss. Not everything is amenable to offsetting. And so our laws need to be really clear about identifying and protecting the areas where offsetting just isn't appropriate. We need to go back and tighten the rules and go back to that strict like-for-like settings. At the moment, there are variation rules that allow you to offset impacts on one species with protections for an entirely different species, or offset impacts through research and education. Those types of indirect offsets are not like for like and don't mean that the impacts that you're creating are going to be appropriately ameliorated through your offset. There's too much flexibility in the rules, and it's contrary to the principle that offsets must be like for like in order to generally compensate for impacts. And then in terms of that option to pay money instead of paying offsets, we'd like to see that removed entirely. What it does, it essentially allows payment for destruction. Proponents can discharge their offset obligations by simply paying money into the fund, meaning that they can go ahead and have their impact before offsets are actually secured. And there's no guarantee that the offsets will be found in a timely manner, or if at all. In our view, offsets need to be secured and in place and improvements achieved before any loss occurs. Lastly, I'm just going to mention a few additional safeguards that can be put in place, or loopholes that can be closed, that will help improve habitat protection. And these are types of tweaks to the biodiversity laws and planning laws that will support a stronger land clearing framework and a stronger offsets framework. So we currently have a system in place where serious and irreversible impacts are assessed. And for certain application, if there are serious and irreversible impacts, proposals need to be refused. But that mechanism isn't applied equally. It's mandated refusal for some projects, but not for major projects such as state significant development and state significant infrastructure, which we know can have the highest impacts. If we're going to have a safeguard like serious and irreversible impacts, then we need to apply it equally across all projects and mandate refusal for all projects where we find that there are serious and irreversible impacts. We need to make sure that we're using our mechanisms such as identifying critical habitat and areas of outstanding biodiversity and protect those areas. At the moment, we have that legal tool. It's just not used very well. No new areas of critical habitat or areas of outstanding biodiversity value, same thing now in New South Wales, have been declared since the new laws commenced. We've just completed a report reflecting on our own efforts to try and get some areas listed recently, and found that it was really hard for third parties to put forward an application for something to be considered, and the government's not proactively declaring new areas under that mechanism. We need to give stronger legislative effect to things like the Save Our Species program. So it's great that we've got investment in this program and there's this fantastic on-ground work happening. But as both Jax and I have said, at the same time, our laws are allowing decisions to be made that are contrary to what we're trying to achieve through those programs. So what we can do is have stronger legislative links between the Save Our Species program and decisions that are being made. So for example, we could impose a duty on decision makers to make sure that the decisions that they're making are consistent with the Save Our Species conservation priorities. If you're familiar with koala conservation, you'll know that there's concerns around the fact that not all core koala habitat in New South Wales is mapped through an appropriate plan of management. What that means is that existing legal protections can't actually do their job properly. So at the moment, core koala habitat cannot be cleared using the codes. The problem is only a handful of councils have their core koala habitat mapped. So while there is a legal protection there, it can't do its job properly because the mapping's not in place. So we need to make sure we close that loophole, put the maps in place and allow the laws to do their job and protect that habitat. And finally, we just need to improve accountability overall, and things like reinstating third-party merit appeal rights would be one way to make sure that decision makers are accountable for the decisions that they're making that are leading to habitat loss. Finally, I'll just reiterate that we need to keep investing in conservation and land management. Those initiatives that we've talked about are really important and should continue and complement the stronger laws that we want to see. So if you'd like any more information, as I said, we've written extensively on our recommendations for law reform. We've published standalone reports on both land clearing and offsets. You can find those on our website if you want any more information. I'm going to pass now to Clancy, who's going to give us a bit of an update on the campaign, what the Alliance is doing and what you can do to help.
Thanks so much, and hello everyone. So I'm just going to briefly go through kind of what we know, the kind of political moment we're in. I might just go to the next slide. We'll take a moment to look at that koala just for a second and remember what we're kind of talking about. We've said a bit. Yeah, we're in a really cool moment. And there is a lot of good happening. Like, we really feel as this alliance, there's been a lot of work to build an alliance amongst lots of different NGOs. And it matters because we all agree kind of with the government on what the problem is, what needs to change. And we know the government's making decisions now. So, the alliance is the first kind of good when we do a bit of a para-analysis. What's going on is we're all united behind a single ask. So government's not hearing lots of different things, not going, oh, but these people say it's about offsets and these people say it's this. Well, we really have kind of agreed on a single framework for reform. And the government's actually accepted that problem. And the Henry review that was kind of the statutory review that Jack's mentioned has really laid out in detail of the stuff that you've heard of tonight, like what needs to happen to stop habitat destruction. And the other thing I see from a comms perspective is we've just done polling, the Nature Conservation Council, and there's overwhelming support for this reform. So people don't like to see nature destroyed, especially when they hear about what the laws are. The real barrier is that people don't know what's happening. They know it's bad. They don't understand the kind of mechanisms. This is kind of technical policy stuff. It's not for your everyday person to kind of get involved in. And so there's a real barrier of government kind of thinking that they don't think it's that important in a lot of ways. We do have an Environment Minister in Penny Sharp who's repeatedly stated the commitments they made for the election, which was to stop runaway land clearing and fix the biodiversity offset scheme. Those two words exactly. And she's continued to state that. And you'll see now, just when the biodiversity report was released, she said the same thing. So government's very aware this is a problem, and what they committed to doing and what we're expecting them to do. And that's been a lot of work to get to that point. Hasn't dropped off. But I guess the bad side of that is what we're hearing from some of the department briefs, which is they're trying to scale back some of the government's commitments. So what we heard is an election commitment to stop runaway land clearing. And then in a department briefing, we heard we want to put downward pressure on runaway land clearing, or just on land clearing, stop some of it, but not stop the problem. And that's really concerning to us that the department's actually briefing that way. I don't know if we went into it too much, but we often think that the Environment Minister is responsible for this kind of thing. But in fact, it's the LLS Act, the Local Land Services Act, that's under the current Agriculture Minister, Tara Moriarty. So it's not just the Environment Minister that needs to deliver this via environment reform. And that's kind of one of the challenges we're facing, I think, is it's two ministers that have to do this, and we don't have necessarily a really supportive minister, or I would say like the Ag Minister is probably not in there to deliver environment reform as much as is to deliver a lot of other things. So this is not a kind of core focus. The other thing that it's really hard to acknowledge, I think, because we're so involved in this, is just how little of a priority environment is for members of the Minns government. It doesn't swing votes. What we need to do as a campaign is tell them it will swing votes and that this is what you're expected to deliver. But Minns is waking up thinking about fixing Sydney's housing crisis, or making sure nurses get paid, like laudable things, but environment really doesn't stack up there as the thing that keeps him awake, that he kind of works through. And that really comes down in just how much priority is put to environment in general. And that's, I think it's really important just to understand that. And the other thing overlaid is the government doesn't hear much about this from us until recently. We've just kind of pushed out this alliance work, but there's a really, really loud agricultural lobby group that have permanent paid positions that walk the halls of Parliament every time. They're buying them drinks, they're running events, they're having them meet with landholders, along with just property developers who like the kind of status quo. And so you do have a power dynamic where I think a lot of the members in government don't hear that much about land clearing. They hear probably more about logging, to be honest. And then they hear a lot about why they shouldn't change the Land Clearing Act and why farmers are doing it tough. And farmers are doing it tough right now. That's not even untrue. So it's kind of just good to understand at a power level, the government's on our side, they accept the problem, but they're probably not feeling the urgency, I guess is how I would summarize it. And that's kind of where the campaign comes in, and we go, okay, well, how do we elevate this as an issue that they'll take action on instead of delay? Because remember, with any minister, any government, there's a million different things they're trying to do. They're getting told stuff all the time. They have meetings. They go, yeah, we accept that. But to actually get them over the line to do the hard policy work and work with the department, and what you've just heard outlined was, it's a lot of different legislative reforms. We know what they are, but they're not easy to get passed. And so if they don't have to, it's easy for governments just to not do it, would be my summary. So yeah, and the final bad thing I'd highlight is biodiversity getting worse. Like the bad thing is just how bad this situation is, and if it continues to be not a core issue, and we get to another election, it's not a core election issue and hasn't been delivered, we really risk a lot of the species that we know and love, a lot of the landscapes we know and love, not existing in a generation. So it's really critical that we take action. So yeah, maybe the next slide, if you could please, Sanj. So we just did some polling, really positive, more than we've ever seen before. So most people want the government to do more to protect nature. It's really important with this to remember, in a lot of polls, people will say, yes, the government should do more on a range of things. But this is really, really overwhelming. Stronger laws to protect nature ranked, 90. It's almost everyone said yes. We've just gone through, and across the board, it's there. The only thing that probably wasn't sure was biodiversity offsets, but and we'll share these slides. You can look. People want the government to protect more nature. Is what you can take from this, and we'll be presenting this to government, and they take this kind of thing seriously. So that's a really good first start. Next slide, if you want to just delve into the specifics. So we looked at land clearing in general. When framed this way, when framed different, otherwise it's not the same. But if you ask, should they reintroduce protections against habitat clearing that was scrapped by the former government, there's 73% support. So outside of the kind of hard Nats vote or the hard Lib vote, it's a yes. If you just say, should you have stronger nature protection laws, it gets slightly less complex. But if you frame it that way, we really kind of proved, I guess, in the comms that if you say to people, former government, Ballarat, remember how bad he was? He just let this like unfettered land clearing happen. Should the government at least start by reintroducing the laws that he scrapped? They go, yeah, they should do that. Ballarat definitely went too far. Interestingly, we asked, I wanted to know the answer to this question, should landholders be trusted to self-assess the ecological value of their land? I think probably in some ways, I really wanted to get a question that wouldn't just support us with polling, and still most people said no. If you had have said, do you think they should be expected to, you would have had a much higher bump, and I'll go into that in a second. But people get the problem, and I think that's what we need to know. We need to use this data when we talk to government, both as organizations, also as citizens, to say, people support this, why aren't you doing it, basically? So yeah, if you go on to the next slide, thanks. So then the real question with any political lobbying is how do you, that's changed the order, sorry. It's how do we get government to protect nature is the next one. Sorry, Andrew, I don't know why it's, there we go, yeah. How do you get the government to do things, right? It's like the perennial question of an NGO, of any peak body, like they'll, they're on our side, they agree with us, they're talking to us about it, they made the election commitment after a lot of lobbying from some of the amazing people that are here. But you really do have to say, what do they care about? Like when you wake up as a minister, as I said, I don't think they wake up thinking, how am I going to fundamentally reform habitat clearing laws? They, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about media. Despite the kind of decline in overall media readership, politicians are probably the strongest readers of the media. They read a media summary every day. They read local and the state press really pedantically. One thing just to know is if you ever do an interview, you ever do anything about this, and you mention a minister's name, they get like an automatic alert to say they've been mentioned. So if you've got a local Labor MP or a local MP and you want them to know something, one of the easiest ways for them to read it is just to say, Minister Tara Moriarty or MP Tara Moriarty needs to do this. It'll come up and they'll get it in email every day. And it's just a really good thing. If you're ever doing media, or if you're ever kind of part of a group, they hear it. And that's what we've been trying to do part of the Alliance, is get this in the media more. Some of you might have seen some interviews we did last week where we got on a country hour and a few other things. And yeah, I think they definitely heard it. They care about media and they care about their constituents. So if you're ever messaging an MP, if we're ever doing any action, that's why some of the do-good actions we've just done, they read their MP address. Actually, I have a good story about this. I was just with a federal minister. I asked, did the minister ever read their inbox? And they said, they've never read their own ministerial inbox. So that goes by the public service. But their constituent inbox, almost no one messages them. So if they get an email, often the minister just on the train to work or in a meeting just reads what constituents have sent them. I think we often forget just how much politicians do try to understand what their community wants and how much power we have just by contacting them directly. If something's obviously a form letter, but it's obviously just a copy and paste they've got 100 times, it's not as effective. But if someone says, hey, I voted for you, or I live in your area, I care about this, what are you going to do about it? They hear that. And you're really talking about instances where an MP might get 2 or 3 emails a day that aren't just kind of spam or hate mail. So they, if you write them a nice letter saying, hey, I'm a constituent and I'm really worried about this. Are you going to, I want you to know I care about this and it'll swing my vote. That's how they get a feel for what their constituents think, because they don't have as much feedback as you'd think. What happens on social media is often pretty vitriolic and trolly. So contacting their MP address is really one of the better ways to do it. They care about polling and being popular. So it's the same thing. That's why we've done this polling that we'll release, and it's really worth kind of including that in anything you're posting on social media or anything you're contacting with people, just saying, hey, this thing that I'm saying actually matters. And the other thing we know, and we hear really consistently every time we talk to the current Labor government, is their election commitments. you know, to a lot of them, they went to the election saying we're going to do this, and so doing the thing is what they're there to do. They're not there to do things they didn't commit to do. We didn't get in the election platform. It's much harder. It's going to take a crisis or something. But if you say, hey, you promised you were going to do this and you're not, you know, that's the frame that lands the most. To go, yes, we did commit to that, so we'll do it. Yeah, someone's just said they care about getting elected. Yeah, that's what they care about. But Labor in particular, they really believe in this, like, we promised the people we would do this thing, so we're going to do it. And a lot of, especially backbenchers, don't know about habitat clearing laws. It wasn't a core campaign issue. You know, they didn't do a big debate on it. So just saying, hey, you know, I voted for Labor because I was really cared about this, or like you came to power promising to do this. I expected you to be different than the Liberal government. I expected you to be like the former government, the former Labor government. Why aren't you? It lands with them really well, and we've seen it time and time again just in our experiences. So if I can give you any advice, like that's the things of what to say. And the other thing is just not rocking the boat. So it's outrageous how many really angry all caps emails politicians get, and they put it in the bin straight away. If you say, like, who cares about farmers? Who cares about developers? No one should have a new, like, if you take an extreme position, they kind of just ignore it. So writing something calm and considered, that's not like, I hate this party, I'll never do it. We're just saying, look, I expected Labor to deliver on this. You know, the Bob Carr government did do a lot of reforms. I expect you to do the same thing. Why haven't you? Just that is really enough to push them across the line. So I'd really just recommend when contacting MPs, firstly, just knowing it really matters. And so that's what a lot of our campaign you'll see is us saying, hey, can you take this action to email the MP or call an MP or come to this event where the MP will see it, because it doesn't take much for them to feel like it's an issue. And we often miss that with the kind of mass appeal stuff where we're talking internally and the MP maybe hasn't even heard it. And the other thing that I'd say in terms of how they need to hear it, they need to tell them why it matters. Just like a really clear reminder, kind of values frame is what we talk in persuasive communications. But I care about this because I want my kids to be able to see koalas in the wild, and I'm worried you're going to fail to deliver that. So really simple why statement is often one of the most powerful things you can do. Stats and numbers, an MP probably would never read, to be honest. Like, they get sent lots of stats and numbers. They're kind of broadly skeptical of them. I don't agree with it, but that's I would just say, like, telling them why it matters is often more powerful than giving a lot of detail, and kind of leave it. There's reports they can read on to find the details. And the other thing with this campaign that's really important is it being about supporting farmers. You know, no one wants to upset farmers. Farmers are having a really rough time right now. You've seen the kind of Coles-Woolworths duopoly thing has just shown how hard it is for them. And if this debate, which is what the kind of farmers federations and some other people, they're trying to frame it as this is greenies versus farmers, sorry, just getting a message. Yeah, that scares them. So yeah, just go on to the last slide if you could, Ange. So what we need to say. The actions you can take is really simple. It's what I've been saying the whole time. It's contacting your MP and tell them the things. And I think these are the 4 things I just go through on what to do. So our existing laws are failing to protect nature or support landholders. And it's really important to say, as Seren said, it's really unreasonable that landholders are expected to have an ecology degree and go around with, like, you know, to find a koala, you often need to sniff a dog in 3 days to know if it's in a tree or not and understand if eucalypt is a koala habitat or not. The laws assume that any landholder can just do that, and they're farmers. They don't know that, and they shouldn't be expected to. So say it's not supporting anyone who wants to protect nature. Talk about how it's kind of counter incentive. So those who profit the most are self-assessing the value, and that doesn't make sense. Make it really clear why it doesn't make sense. You know, everyone else has to get environmental approvals to build a house, except when it comes to land clearing, where it's just you can give yourself regulatory approval. And yeah, the landholder piece that I just spoke to. So yeah, I'll go to the actions you can take really quickly. We've got a do-gooder page. We've got all of the kind of summary there. Yes, even if your MP is a Nat, even if your MP is anyone, they really do read these things. Email them using our action page. Just contact their like MP address, not their ministerial address, and they will probably read it, especially if they get a few. A considered letter they do reply to. They really like take pride in it. Tagging them in social media posts, that works. Tagging them underneath a news article about it. So if there's a local news story about it, you tag the MP and say, hey, are you doing something about this? They'll see it. Calling them, they really, really do get told what their office says. I think we often expect that MPs have 10 or 20 staff, but it's often just them and their EA or their office administrator in an office for the day. They're in the electorate. So calling them and having them hear stuff, they actually don't get it that much. And you're often talking to the chief of staff or someone. So call them. And going in person, standing out the front with a placard, going in to talk to them, whatever else. As long as you do it in a way that says, hey, this matters to me and you're meant to represent me, can you do it? If you come at them with anger, come at them with partisanship, they get into politician mode and they ignore you, or they kind of switch off. But if you come and say, this matters to me, this is why, this is my case, I expect this of you, it really can make a difference. And that's what we're hearing from government right now, is they need to hear more. So yeah, I might leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Clancy, for that whirlwind journey into campaign comms. So we'll just wrap up really quickly and with the next slide, and then then I'll hand over to Vic to just wrap up. And if there's any other, maybe one question, if people are happy to hang around for a moment. But yes, as we've discussed, there are decision and like pressure moments coming up for us over the next little while. The first is right now. The next opportunity will be when the government does hand down its response to the Ken Henry review and the review of the Local Land Services Act. There'll be inquiries potentially into that legislation. There will be the federal environment law reform process, which has been noted in the chat. There's going to be implications for New South Wales around that. But anytime something big happens for nature, we need to be putting pressure on about this particular issue. I also just want to note that Anna, yes, we are going to record. We are going to make the recording available, and we'll send it around to attendees for sure. And please share, so we can get lots more people taking action. But yeah, I also just really quickly want to note that we really want this win. We really want these laws to change for the better. But we also are really aware that that little change is going to, well, it's not little, but that change is occurring within a system, and that's a system that is harming ecosystems upon which we depend. It's rewarding bad actors, it's excluding communities, and it's systematically discriminating against First Nations groups and traditional owners. So the codes are really important, but that's not enough on its own. We've spent the last couple of months talking to landholders and farming organisations, and so far, as Clancy mentioned, we really do agree that if the system is going to change, we need to bring the influence of farmers, the rights and entitlements and the wisdom of traditional owners, and the love for nature among communities like ours all together, and look for new ways to look after and revegetate and support biodiversity and its resilience in the coming decades. So we're going to keep doing that. And we're going to try and stay really active about this issue over the next year or so. And we hope you're able to as well. So just logistics wise, we will share this recording, and we will share these slides with everyone who attended, and we'll make them available more generally as well, so that if you have people who are interested, please share the information on with them. And we'll also share some socials tiles that you can share yourselves over the next few days. So back to you, Vic, to wrap us up.
Thanks, Jax. I know our next slide says questions, but actually we've answered all the questions in the chat because we were conscious we were running a little over time. So everybody should have an answer to the question that they've raised, which means I think I'll just wrap us up with the next slide. It's got links to some resources. As Jack said, we'll be sending out an email with this recording, the links to these resources, the link to take action. Thank you all so much for spending a little slice of your night with us and for your interest in taking action to end habitat destruction in New South Wales. Have a lovely rest of your evening and see you again soon.